Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Mitglieder und Freunde unserer Gesellschaft, ich freue mich, Sie auch heute in Regensburg und online begrüßen zu dürfen. Besonders begrüßen möchte ich natürlich Herrn Botschafter Michael Reiffenstuel, den Beauftragten für Südosteuropa, die Türkei, OSZE und Europarat im Auswärtigen Amt. Lieber Michael, schön, dass du zu uns gekommen bist. Es ist sehr schön, dass du da bist. Und natürlich freuen wir uns auch besonders, unsere diesjährige Preisträgerin Dr. Claudia Laštro von der Universität Graz begrüßen zu dürfen. Herzlich willkommen. Ebenso begrüßen wir natürlich herzlich unsere Sprecherinnen und Sprecher des Panels, das uns gleich beglücken wird, zum Thema Aging Societies and Immigration in Southeast Europe, Real Challenges and Imagined Threats. Das sind Professor Dr. Florian Bieber vom Center for Southeast European Studies, auch von der Universität Graz. Florian, schön, dass du da bist und nicht im Skiurlaub bist. Ainur vom Regional Program Specialist on Population and Development vom UNFPA Regional Office for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Professor Dr. Eva Fodor, Professor of Gender Studies, Central European University in Wien bzw. Budapest. Und Professor Dr. Maja Gerowska-Mitev, Professor of Social Policy von der Universität Skopje. Moderieren wird die Diskussion unser eigentlicher Gastgeber. Eigentlich bin ich ja nur der begrüßende Gast, Professor Dr. Ulf Brunbauer. Vielen herzlichen Dank für die Moderation und auch, dass wir hier beim IOS dieses Jahr so schön und angenehm unterschlupfen konnten. Sie haben sogar Sonne für uns organisiert. Vielen herzlichen Dank. Wir sind sehr gerne bei Ihnen. Für die musikalische Untermalung sorgt heute Leonard Prokesch am Klavier. Wir haben es gerade schon gehört. Vielen Dank, schön, dass Sie bei uns sind. Aber bevor ich gleich etwas über die Arbeit der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft im letzten Jahr berichten möchte, möchte ich zunächst das Wort an Botschafter Reiffenstuel für eine kleine Begrüßung geben. Vielen Dank.
Ja, einen schönen guten Morgen. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ich hier sein darf, inzwischen zum dritten Male. Lieber Manuel, liebe Präsidiumsmitglieder, liebe Mitglieder und Freunde von der SOG. Ähm, Bevor ich zu den eigentlichen Arbeiten von der SOG komme, vielleicht zwei, drei Takte zu uns, zum Auswärtigen Amt. Wir haben ja doch momentan eine wirklich spannende neue Situation. Zum ersten Mal seit 60 Jahren haben wir jetzt einen CDU-Außenminister wieder. Wir haben für uns momentan einen wirklich spannenden Prozess des Auswärtigen Amtes, wo wir, glaube ich, die größte Restrukturierung seit 40, 50 Jahren vollziehen. Aber das ist letztendlich ein Prozess, glaube ich, der immer wieder ganz gut und wichtig ist, dass wir uns auf Veränderungen, die wir in der internationalen Gemeinschaft haben, auch im internationalen Gefüge versuchen, eben neu darauf einzustellen. Und schauen wir mal, wie gut wir das letztendlich dann auch umsetzen werden. Zum westlichen Balkan vor allem, den ich ja mache, also neben Türkei und ein paar anderen Ländern. Wir haben einen großen, wirklich großen Vorteil, dass wir einen Außenminister haben mit Johan Wadefuhl, der die Region seit sehr, sehr langer Zeit kennt, der mit eigentlich so gut wie allen Akteuren vernetzt ist, der, glaube ich, auch, und das ist wichtig, auch die internen Wirkmechanismen, wenn wir das mal so ausdrücken, des Balkan kennen und dem auch der Balkan wirklich wichtig ist. Also insbesondere die Web6-Staaten und eben die Begleitung auf ihrem Weg Richtung Europa. Er wollte eigentlich übrigens von Anfang an reisen. Es gab drei Anläufe, die letztendlich nicht an uns gescheitert sind, sondern an den Partnern. Aber er ist dann eben auch tatsächlich noch relativ frühzeitig im letzten Jahr gereist, hat eine sogenannte, wir nennen das Speed-Dating-Tour gemacht. Erst wollten wir zwei Länder besuchen, dann sind es drei geworden, vier und dann irgendwann war natürlich klar, jetzt müssen wir in alle sechs Länder fahren. Aber es war ein wichtiges Signal an den westlichen Balkan, dass er uns wichtig ist, dass er der deutschen Politik wichtig ist, dass er auch der neuen Bundesregierung wichtig ist und dass wir eben von unserer Seite einerseits ein klares Bekenntnis, und das gilt gerade auch für Außenminister Wadefuller, dass wir ein klares Bekenntnis haben, wir wollen diesen westlichen Balkan in die Europäische Union führen. aber andererseits aber auch klar gemacht haben, die Länder müssen ihren Teil dafür tun. Also es ist kein Selbstläufer. Ein Tag, den ich vielleicht hier auch noch ausführen wollte, weil ja viele sich mal gefragt haben mit der Trump-Administration, wie wird letztendlich die US-Politik ausschauen, insbesondere nachdem es ja auch den Rückzug von USAID gab für die Projekte, was ich sehr bedauere, weil damit viele zivilgesellschaftliche Akteure in der Region einfach Funding vermissen, was wir Europäer, was wir Deutsche etc. nicht wirklich ausgleichen können. Das Gute ist, glaube ich, dass tatsächlich die Amerikaner, wir hatten gerade gestern das sogenannte Quint-Format in Brüssel, dass die Amerikaner klar gemacht haben, sie wollen weiterhin auch in diesen Formaten, auch mit der EU, auch mit uns zusammenarbeiten. Allerdings auch klar gemacht haben, dass sich ihr Fokus verschoben hat und der Fokus ist primär Wirtschaft. Das, glaube ich, kann man so sehr deutlich sagen. Das Positive dabei ist, das ist ein Aspekt, was wir, glaube ich, oft übersehen, wenn wir uns die letzten 12 Monate anschauen. Es gab viel extrem schädliche Rhetorik, aber rein hart sicherheitspolitisch ist es ruhig geblieben. Das lag, glaube ich, auch daran, dass die Vereinigten Staaten eben gewissen regionalen Akteuren sehr, sehr klar machen, die Grenze für sie ist sehr, sehr klar dort, wo eben tatsächlich Rhetorik einen Spillover auf die Sicherheitssituation letztendlich hat. So, ansonsten nur noch vielleicht 3, 4 Takte. Was uns wichtig ist, wir haben endlich im Kosovo wieder eine funktionsfähige Regierung, was, glaube ich, überfällig war. Leider hat Kosovo eigentlich ein Jahr verloren. Also nicht nur im Bereich Normalisierungsdialog, sondern auch auf dem Weg Richtung stärkere Überzeugung der Nicht-Anerkenner, zum Beispiel, dass man sowohl im EU-Bereich, Stichwort Übersendung des Briefes vom Beitrittsantrag endlich, aber auch im NATO-Bereich, dass wir sie einfach näher heranführen können an beide Institutionen. Beide wären für uns wichtig und gerade für die Kosovaren, glaube ich, ist auch die NATO-Frage ist extrem wichtig und irgendwann mal eben Partnership for Peace. So, jetzt haben wir dort noch die Wahlen letztendlich für die Präsidentschaft. Und wenn das auch noch gut geht, dann hätten wir eigentlich wieder eine funktionsfähige Regierung. Serbien sehen wir wirklich mit viel Sorge, dass wir letztlich, wenn man ganz ehrlich ist, keine Fortschritte haben auf dem Weg Richtung Europa, sondern eigentlich sind es Rückschritte und der letzte schlagende Beweis waren dafür eben diese 5 sogenannten Mrdic-Gesetze, die banal gesagt einfach darauf abzielen, die Staatsanwaltschaft, insbesondere auch die Verfahren zu Novisat etc., zur Korruption, so zu schwächen, auch was das Personal für die Staatsanwaltschaften angeht, dass eben letztendlich eine konsequente juristische Aufarbeitung schwieriger wird. Plus, wir haben immer noch Radojcic, wo wir bei jeder Gelegenheit strafrechtliche Verfolgung fordern. Wir haben immer noch die Medienaufsichtsbehörde REM, was nicht gelöst ist. Und wir haben auch immer noch die Frage des Wählerregisters, die eigentlich sehr, sehr zentral ist. Insofern versuchen wir immer wieder in unseren Gesprächen, und das hat auch gerade der Außenminister klar gemacht, zu Serbien, wir wollen euch in der Europäischen Union sehen, aber den Weg, den ihr momentan beschreitet, ist der falsche. Der bringt euch nicht näher ran, sondern letztendlich führt er euch weiter weg. Aber bevor ich jetzt noch zu lange hier ausführe, vielleicht ein paar Takte, was uns wirklich wichtig ist, nämlich die Zusammenarbeit mit Ihnen, mit der SOG. Hier steht ein Satz, so wurde mir so aufgeschrieben, aber es ist wirklich zentral. Sie spielen eine ganz wichtige und zentrale Rolle, nämlich auch das Interesse für den westlichen Balkan und darüber hinaus für ihre gesamte Region, die sie abdecken, im politischen Raum, im zivilgesellschaftlichen Raum, im wissenschaftlichen Raum aufrechtzuerhalten. Und das ist gerade für uns von der politischen Seite ist extrem wichtig, auch im parlamentarischen Bereich etc. Sie haben auch Veranstaltungen im Westbalkan-Salon gemacht, mit lieben Grüßen von Nils von Rediger, was er sehr, sehr geschätzt hat, gerade auch zu diesen sehr, sehr schwierigen Themen, was unsere eigene Geschichte und unsere eigene Vergangenheit auf dem Balkan angeht. Und ich glaube, wir können da wirklich mit gutem Beispiel vorangehen und nicht nur in der Region kritisieren, dass wir viel zu wenig Versöhnung haben. Ich glaube, der beste Weg, das mehr Überzeugungsarbeit zu leisten, ist selbst voranzugehen und zeigen, wir sind auch bereit, uns mit unserer eigenen Geschichte auseinanderzusetzen. Sie waren sehr aktiv, über 130 Veranstaltungen, aber eben nicht nur Quantität, die wichtig ist, sondern vor allem eben auch Qualität. Wir haben diese Veranstaltungen wirklich, sei es Publikationen, Podcasts, Sie haben, glaube ich, immer mehr Social Media Präsenz, was einfach sehr, sehr wichtig ist. Wir haben das sehr, sehr geschätzt. Sie sind, Sie bleiben einer unserer vertrauensvollsten Partner. Wir schätzen die Zusammenarbeit sehr, hoffen, dass es auch in diesem Jahr gut gemeinsam weitergeht. Und ich lese hier, auch im nächsten Jahr haben Sie das 75-jährige Jubiläum. Also insofern kann ich jetzt noch nicht gratulieren, aber ich freue mich dann schon nächstes Jahr darauf, dass mit Sicherheit dann auch hier jemand stehen wird, der Ihnen gratulieren wird. Herzlichen Dank.
Vielen Dank, lieber Michael. Vielen Dank auch für das Kompliment an unsere Gesellschaft. Dazu möchte ich zwei Sachen sagen. Erstens, das möchte ich gerne zurückgeben. Wir spüren großes Vertrauen in der Zusammenarbeit mit, aber auch vom Auswärtigen Amt in unsere Arbeit. Und das ist eine ganz wichtige Grundlage für unsere Arbeit und das Engagement, das unsere Gesellschaft auch zeigt, neben dem finanziellen Anteil, den das Auswärtige Amt an unserer Arbeit auch leistet. Vielen herzlichen Dank noch einmal an das Auswärtige Amt in deiner Person heute hier. Und das Zweite ist, dass ich einfach mal einen Großteil dieses Lobs erstens an das Netzwerk, aber vor allem auch an unsere Geschäftsstelle an dieser Stelle schon weitergeben möchte. Ich weiß, ihr habt mir für später schon aufgeschrieben, euch zu loben, aber dieser großartige Eindruck, den wir im Auswärtigen Amt offenbar machen, der liegt natürlich in erster Linie neben unseren großartigen Köpfen im Netzwerk an eurer Arbeit in der Geschäftsstelle. Lieber Christian, liebe Viktoria, liebes ganze Team, vielen Dank für eure Arbeit auch im letzten Jahr. Ja, und Michael Reiffenstuel hatte schon angesprochen, wir leben in herausfordernden geopolitischen Zeiten. Gerade das Thema des Rückzugs der Vereinigten Staaten im Bereich Fördergelder ist von dir angesprochen worden und die gestiegene Erwartungshaltung gegenüber der Europäischen Union. Ich glaube aber auch insbesondere gegenüber Deutschland. Das hat auch unsere Arbeit begleitet, so wie auch die von dir angesprochene Situation in Serbien mit den Protesten, die Reformprozesse auf dem Weg in Richtung EU-Erweiterung, wo eine neue Dynamik drin ist, aber manchmal vielleicht auch das Detail trotzdem umso wichtiger ist. All das hat auch uns begleitet, so wie wichtige Wahlen in Moldau, in Rumänien, im Kosovo, auch im letzten Jahr zweimal allein Parlamentswahlen, in Kroatien und auch in Albanien die Parlamentswahlen. All diese Wahlen begleitete die SOG mit digitalen und physischen Podiumsdiskussionen im Vorfeld sowie mit Publikationen. Im Nachgang zur Analyse der Ergebnisse, die Proteste in Serbien, haben wir von Anfang an intensiv begleitet mit diversen Diskussionsveranstaltungen, Hintergrundartikeln in den Südosteuropa-Mitteilungen. Darüber hinaus haben wir ein paar besondere Foki-Punkte gesetzt auf Jahrestage, die uns in 2025 begegnet sind. Einerseits der Genozid von Srebrenica und das Dayton Agreement, das sich zum 30. Mal jährte, haben wir mit verschiedenen Partnerorganisationen in Podiumsdiskussionen mit Zeitzeugen und Überlebenden thematisiert. Und auf der Leipziger Buchmesse in 2025 haben wir eine Diskussion auch zu Bosnien und Herzegowina mit dem Titel 30 Jahre Frieden, aber wie weiter in der Zukunft organisiert. Auch unsere junge SOG, die sehr erfolgreich arbeitet und sehr engagiert ist, hat sich in 2025 im Rahmen einer Exkursion mit Bosnien beschäftigt. Gestern hat uns unsere Rechnungsprüferin dargelegt, wie günstig unsere jungen SOG-Mitglieder verreist sind. Das müssten wir vielleicht noch, das dürfen wir niemals dem Auswärtigen Amt erzählen. Dann gibt es große Probleme mit dem Reisebudget. Aber das ist auch ein wichtiges Signal gewesen, dass es dort Interesse von unserer jungen SOG gibt. Und nicht zuletzt hat die Internationale Hochschulwoche sich unter Leitung von Heike Kage, Jaljana Tunic und Gerd Düsings mit dem Thema der Jugoslawienkriege in den 90ern beschäftigt. Ein weiter wichtiger Fokuspunkt war unsere Geschichtskonferenz, die du ja auch angesprochen hast, 80 Jahre nach Beginn des Zweiten Weltkriegs über die deutsche Verantwortung für Krieg und Besatzung und die Folgen zu sprechen. Viele von Ihnen wissen, dass das gerade für mich persönlich ein sehr wichtiges Thema ist. Ich glaube auch ein Thema, wo wir ein bisschen Pionierarbeit leisten, obwohl es 80 Jahre her ist. Aber tatsächlich war die Stimmung auf dieser Konferenz, glaube ich, ein Beleg dafür, dass es wichtig ist, dieses Thema mit einem politisch sehr klar gewählten Fokus auf deutsche Verantwortung zu betrachten. Und wir arbeiten noch daran, in vernünftiger Weise das Thema weiter zu bewegen. Da sind wir noch nicht richtig entschieden, wie weit wir es machen, wie wir es genau machen. Aber auch bei dieser Konferenz war es so, wir haben mehr als 2 Jahre, glaube ich, an ihr geplant und sozusagen wollten da jeden Schritt auch ohne ins Fettnäpfchen zu treten machen. Und da galt dann lieber Sorgfalt als Schnelligkeit. Wir werden auf jeden Fall an dem Thema dranbleiben. Historische Themen, Historiker haben ja auch öfters mehr Ruhe in der Arbeit mit Themen. Eine weitere wichtige Veranstaltung war natürlich die Studienreise für die Mitglieder, die nach Zypern führte, unter Führung von Hans-Jörg Brey und Martin Weiß. Viele wissen, dass dieses Team immer grandiose Studienreisen macht, aber Hans-Jörg Brey ist ja auch ein bekennender alter Liebhaber der Insel. Und als ich das Programm zum ersten Mal gesehen habe, habe ich nur gedacht, Mist, das ist so großartig. Leider hatte ich keine Zeit mitzukommen. Ich glaube, diese Studienreise bleibt allen im Gedächtnis und vielen Dank wieder einmal für die Organisation dieser Reise. Lieber Martin, lieber Hans-Jörg, das ist ein großartiges Asset. Vielleicht müsstest du da mal mitfahren. Das ist, glaube ich, auch eine lustige Crew, die da unterwegs ist. Ja, und auch verschiedene Preise haben wir letztes Jahr verliehen. Die Jiricek-Medaille an Maria Todorova. Zu Maria Todorova muss man nicht viel sagen, eine der Grand Dames der Südosteuropa-Forschung. Und den Solidaritätspreis für Medienschaffende aus der Region haben wir an Elif Akgül verliehen im Deutschen Bundestag. Eine türkische Journalistin, die angeklagt wurde, ich glaube sogar noch immer noch angeklagt ist und uns online zugeschaltet sein konnte, weil sie mit einem Ausreiseverbot belegt war, aber relativ frisch für unsere Preisüberreichung immerhin aus dem Gefängnis nach Hause durfte, also aus der Untersuchungshaft nach Hause entlassen wurde. An dieser Stelle ein herzlicher Dank für alle Spenderinnen und Spender, die diesen Preis möglich gemacht haben. Aktuell suchen wir noch nach Vorschlägen für die Preisträgerin oder den Preisträger im Jahr 2026 und nach finanziellen Beiträgen für die Preissumme, weil unser Vorrat an Spenden für diese kleine Summe an Dotation, die wir dort aus spendenden Preisträgern vergeben, leider aufgebraucht ist. Gleichzeitig ist 1.000 Euro, kann ich hier, glaube ich, sagen, es ist nicht geheim, es ist nicht viel. Aber wenn man dann den Preisträgern, die halt im Bundestag für ihre Arbeit, die auch oft unter Druck stehen zu Hause, von der Regierung oder auch, sagen wir mal so, von inoffiziellen Gründen, wenn man denen sagt, dass diese Summe aus Spenden von Privatpersonen zusammenkommt, dann ist das schon auch nochmal immer eine Motivation, die zeigt, hier ist es Leuten wichtig, einfach Menschen wichtig, dass sie ihre Arbeit machen. Ich glaube, dass man das nicht unterschätzen darf, wie wichtig das ist. Wie schon gesagt, die junge SOG ist sehr erfolgreich mit der Exkursion nach Bosnien und Herzegowina, mit dem Mentoring-Programm, wo nun schon über 20 Mentoring-Paare vermittelt werden konnten. Vielen Dank an alle diejenigen, darf ich jetzt Alten sagen, an die erfahrenen Mitglieder der SOG, die sich zum Mentoring für die junge SOG bereit erklärt haben. Von denen sind sicherlich auch heute einige im Raum. Ansonsten, wer das noch werden möchte, kann die junge SOG natürlich auch ansprechen. Die junge SOG hat auch eine Online-Reihe zur Berufsberatung gemacht, wo sozusagen, also wenn man sich mit Südosteuropa beschäftigt, gerade im Studienbereich, ist ja nicht automatisch klar, welchen Berufsweg man einschlägt. Also bei mir als Historiker war klar, eigentlich muss ich Taxifahrer werden, aber mit der Südosteuropa-Forschung und da war halt die Idee zu sagen, wir bringen verschiedene Karrierewegsvorbilder, um sozusagen einfach Anregungen zu geben, Fragen beantworten zu können zusammen. Ich glaube, das war eure Idee zusammen mit der Geschäftsstelle. Ich gucke gerade Philipp an, weil ich ihn sehe, den ehemaligen Sprecher der jungen SOG bis gestern. Auch da, wenn es hier im Saal Leute gibt, die sagen, okay, ich bin bereit, das zu machen, meine eigene sozusagen Karrierebiografie darzustellen. Vielleicht ist es interessant für die junge SOG, bitte das Gespräch suchen. Ja, und natürlich das digitale studentische Symposium und die Zukunftswerkstatt der jungen SOG, also insgesamt ein großes Programm, viel Engagement, viel Arbeit der jungen SOG. Auch dafür noch einmal an dieser Stelle vielen herzlichen Dank an das Sprecherinnen-Team, das hier heute da ist und alle Mitglieder, die entweder online oder hier im Raum zuhören. Zu unserem Nachwuchsprogramm gehören natürlich auch unsere Förderpreise, die wir letztes Jahr in Zusammenarbeit mit der Fritz und Helga Exner-Stiftung verliehen haben. Die Preisträgerinnen des Dissertationspreises 2025 waren Shofi Turoci zu ungarischen Freimaurernetzwerken im Orient und Laszlo Serences zu Turkish Foreign Policy in Kosovo und Serbia. Preisträgerin für herausragende Masterarbeiten bei Libel zum Thema bosnische Frauen im Krieg. Ja, ach so, was ich gerade noch vergessen habe, Philipp Pietsch, nochmal vielen Dank für die Arbeit als Sprecher der jungen SOG in den letzten 2 Jahren und einen herzlichen Gruß an Mara Hann und Gunnar Zerm, das neue Sprecherteam. Mara schon länger, Gunnar seit gestern der jungen SOG. Wir freuen uns auf die Zusammenarbeit mit euch. Bei der gestrigen Mitgliederversammlung haben wir den Output der SOG noch einmal in Zahlen gefasst. Du hast es ja auch erwähnt, 62 Tagungen, Konferenzen, Workshops, Podiumsdiskussion, insgesamt über 2300 Teilnehmerinnen, allein organisiert von der Münchner Geschäftsstelle. Dazu noch 120 Vorträge, Lesungen, Diskussionen an den 23 Zweigstellen in Deutschland und Österreich. Die Publikation mit der Südosteuropa-Mitteilung und dem digitalen Format Southeast Europe in Focus mit über 1000 Abonnenten sowie pro Southeast Europe in Focus Ausgabe ungefähr 1000 Downloads. Ja, das ist eine faszinierende Bilanz. Der Podcast, der auch schon angesprochen wurde, wird auch ganz gut runtergeladen. Ich habe gestern schon mich herzlich bei euch bedankt, dass ihr so innovative Projekte und Programme angeht. Ihr wisst schon, dass viele Podcasts inzwischen auch normalerweise mit der Möglichkeit eines Videos versehen sind. Christian möchte das irgendwie nicht. Wir werden darüber nochmal sprechen. Ich glaube, also wir werden dich vielleicht schon noch überzeugen. Aber den Podcast weiterzuentwickeln, das war eine Idee von euch, ist eine große Aufgabe von uns. Das ist ganz toll, dass ihr bereit seid, neue Sachen auszuprobieren, euch voranzuwagen und eben diese neuen Formate auch für uns zu explorieren. Für diese ganzen Publikationen müssen wir aber natürlich nicht nur der Geschäftsstelle danken, sondern auch allen unseren ehrenamtlichen Gremienmitgliedern, die Veranstaltungen organisieren, die zur Publikation beitragen, im Präsidium, im wissenschaftlichen Beirat, in den Zweigstellen, im Preis- und Stipendienrat, in der jungen SOG. Es ist ein besonders wichtiges Engagement, das diese Arbeit erst möglich macht. Wir möchten auch natürlich danken, dass wir heute hier bei Professor Dr. Brunnbauer zu Gast sein dürfen. Organisiert wurde es aber eigentlich von Professor Klaus Buchenau und von Gresa Morina. Vielen Dank euch beiden für die Organisation. Wir haben uns hier sehr aufgehoben gefühlt. Vielen Dank, dass wir in Regensburg da sein durften. Und nicht, ja. Und nicht zu vergessen, wenn man über Publikationen redet, ist natürlich auch, dass die Rechtschreibfehler nicht drinnen sind, dass man guckt, dass redaktionell alles stimmt. Das klingt nach einer Kleinigkeit, aber wir haben mit Stefanie Streloke im Team eine großartige Kraft, die uns dabei begleitet. Der Erfolg unserer Publikation ist zu einem großen Teil auch der Erfolg der Arbeit von dir, liebe Stefanie Streloke. Vielen herzlichen Dank und einen Applaus dafür. Die Geschäftsstelle und das Auswärtige Amt hatte ich ja gerade schon gelobt. Also die Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft genießt ein hohes Renommee. Wir haben die Arbeit einer Mittlerorganisation zwischen der Region und dem deutschsprachigen Raum eingenommen. Wir haben ein großes Netzwerk, aber natürlich lebt unsere Arbeit und unser Netzwerk auch davon, dass wir eine gewisse politische Vernetzung haben. Und deswegen möchte ich hier noch einmal von der Mitgliederversammlung gestern berichten. Wir haben sozusagen eine Verjüngung oder eine Erneuerung unserer politischen Vizepräsidenten erfolgreich durchführen können. Wir haben nachdem nachdem Josip Juratovic aus dem Bundestag ausgeschieden ist im letzten Jahr und ich ja schon vor etwas längerer Zeit bei SPD und Grünen neu besetzt und nachdem Peter Bayer, unser langjähriger Vizepräsident MdB von der CDU, es nicht mehr geschafft hat, uns weiter zu begleiten aufgrund seines Arbeitspensums, haben wir also bei CDU, Grünen und SPD neue Vizepräsidenten für uns gewinnen und überzeugen können. Das sind Jasmina Hostad von der SPD, die Vorsitzende der Parlamentariergruppe Südosteuropa im Deutschen Bundestag und eine langjährig mit dem Thema Westbalkan verbundene Sozialdemokratin aus Baden-Württemberg, mit Boris Mijatovic aus Nordhessen von den Grünen, den langjährigen Westbalkan-Experten der Grünen im Bundestag und mit Karl Philipp Sassenrath, einen jungen, sehr intelligenten und sympathischen CDUler aus Nordrhein-Westfalen, der neue Berichterstattung für die Region übernommen hat. und der uns, glaube ich, sehr erfolgreich begleiten wird. Damit stellen wir uns auch sozusagen in unserem Netzwerk im Bundestag neu auf und auch jünger auf. Auch wenn wir nächstes Jahr 75 Jahre alt werden, sind wir keineswegs alt oder altmodisch. Allein schon, weil wir einen großen Mitgliederzuwachs haben, der nicht zuletzt auch durch junge Mitglieder, durch die Arbeit der jungen SOG getragen wird. Also während wir älter werden, verjüngern wir uns anscheinend. Dazu versuchen wir natürlich auch auf Instagram und mit dem Podcast Formate anzubieten, die auch für junge Menschen attraktiv sind. Kommen wir nun zum nächsten Programmpunkt, die Verleihung des Dissertationspreises. Zu Beginn möchte ich natürlich als allererstes der Fritz und Helga Exner-Stiftung danken, insbesondere Frau Dr. Helga Exner-Freisfeld. Ohne die großartige Unterstützung der Stiftung wäre es uns nicht möglich, regelmäßig herausragende Dissertationen im Bereich der Südosteuropa-Forschung zu verleihen und natürlich nicht nur den Preisträgerinnen und ihrer Arbeit eine Bühne zu geben, sondern sie auch kennenzulernen. Deswegen möchte ich auch im Namen der ganzen Gesellschaft mich herzlich bei unserem Preis- und Stipendienrat bedanken, der die zahlreichen Bewerbungen gründlich durcharbeitet, bewertet und am Ende sich auf Preistragende einigt. Vielen Dank für eure Arbeit auch in diesem Jahr. Ihr habt ausgesucht in diesem Jahr Dr. Claudia Laštro, die mit ihrer Dissertation mit dem Titel Do Illit Split Stabilized Autocratic Regimes, Case Studies of Serbia and Montenegro eine herausragende Arbeit vorgelegt hat. An dieser Stelle möchte ich das Wort übergeben an den Laudator Franz Lothar Altmann. Ja, du wirst etwas sagen, danach wird Claudia Laštro einige Worte erwidern. Du hast das Wort.
Ja, danke, Manuel. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Mitglieder der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft, eine kleine Bemerkung zu Beginn. Wie Sie sehen, die Arbeit ist auf Englisch geschrieben. Ich werde aber die Laudatio in deutscher Sprache halten, nachdem wir hier eine deutsche Gesellschaft auch sind. Für die wenigen, die das Deutsche vielleicht nicht mächtig sind, habe ich eine fast wörtliche Englischübersetzung vorbereitet, die, glaube ich, schon verteilt wurde oder hier zur Verfügung steht. Manuel Sarrazin hat schon erwähnt, dass die Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft jedes Jahr aus einer Anzahl von exzellenten Dissertationen, die sich mit Südosteuropa-Themen beschäftigen, eine Arbeit auswählt, um diese mit dem besonderen Dissertationspreis der Gesellschaft auszuzeichnen. Dieses Jahr, oder das heißt letztes Jahr, wurden 10 Arbeiten eingereicht und der Preis- und Stipendienausschuss musste wieder einmal feststellen, dass die außergewöhnliche Qualität der eingereichten Arbeiten die Wahl überaus schwierig gemacht hat. Die Entscheidung fiel schließlich auf diese Arbeit von Dr. Claudia Laštro. Das Thema steht hier auf dem Screen. Auf Deutsch: Stabilisieren Brüche innerhalb von Eliten autokratische Systeme? Fragezeichen. Beispielstudien Serbien und Montenegro. Wenn man den Titel der Arbeit liest, ist man zunächst etwas irritiert, weil man sich an Beispiele aus der nicht zu weit zurückliegenden Vergangenheit erinnert, als Zerwürfnisse innerhalb der herrschenden Eliten in autokratischen Systemen die Hauptursache für den Zusammenbruch der Regime waren. Man denkt dabei an die Sowjetunion 1991 oder an die arabischen Revolutionen 2011 in Tunesien und Ägypten. Man würde also eher dazu tendieren, anzunehmen, dass Spaltungserscheinungen innerhalb von Eliten in den Führungsstrukturen eine Bedrohung und nicht eine Stabilisierung für die autokratischen Regime darstellen. Die Autorin rekurriert jedoch bereits in ihrer Einleitung auf empirische Erkenntnisse, dass nicht alle Spaltungserscheinungen automatisch den Niedergang von Regimen verursachen. Dass es vielmehr zahlreiche Beispiele von autokratischen Regimen gibt, Verzeihung, ich habe eine leichte Erkältung stecken, dass es also zahlreiche Beispiele gibt, die nach größeren Spannungen oder Abtrünnigkeiten innerhalb des Elitesystems noch für eine längere Zeit stabil geblieben sind. Die Autorin verweist hier wieder auf historische Beispiele, wie die Kommunistische Partei der Sowjetunion nach 1964 oder die Kommunistische Partei Chinas, die über mehrere Dekaden bis heute stabil blieb, oder auch auf die Türkei, wo das Zerwürfnis zwischen Erdogan und Gülen das System nicht beschädigte, sondern zunächst sogar stabilisierte. Danke. Laštro argumentiert, dass Autokratien manchmal sogar absichtlich Zerwürfnisse innerhalb von Elitezirkeln initiieren und dabei von diesen Vorgängen sogar in Bezug auf Stabilisierung und Verlängerung ihrer Herrschaft profitieren. In autokratischen Systemen besteht ein Wettbewerb zwischen Akteuren, die von den bestehenden politischen Strukturen profitieren, und anderen, die auf eine Gelegenheit für einen Wechsel in der Verteilung der Macht zu ihrem Vorteil warten. Die Autorin identifiziert eine Vielzahl von endogenen und schrittweisen Prozessen, die Konflikte innerhalb der Regimen auslösen, beispielsweise ideologische Differenzen, die zuvor verborgen waren, oder Rotationen innerhalb der Elite, die bestehende interne Gruppierungen umbilden und dabei politische Unstimmigkeiten verursachen. Die Erscheinung neuer Elitegruppen infolge schleichenden Generationswechsels oder auch neue Oppositionsakteure können konfliktauslösend sein. Elitespaltungen können aber auch als strategisches Instrument dienen, um Dispute zu lösen oder auch neue und stabilere Arrangements für die Machtverteilung zu verhandeln oder auch um rebellische Elitenteile zu vertreiben oder sogar um ideologische Veränderungen vorzubereiten. Laštro hat in ihrer Arbeit Montenegro als Hauptbeispielsfall gewählt, wobei sie Serbien als Kontrastfall benutzt. In Serbien hielt Slobodan Milošević an einem restriktiven Regime fest, während in Montenegro eine vielseitigere Elite die nötigen ideologischen Veränderungen erleichterte. Montenegros dominierende Partei, die Demokratische Partei der Sozialisten, war flexibler. Sie öffnete sich für neue Eliten und konnte über 3 Jahrzehnte von 1990 bis 2020 an der Macht bleiben, während Serbiens rigidere Machtpartei, die Sozialistische Partei Serbiens, sich unfähig zeigte, mögliche Partner oder neue politische Akteure aufzunehmen und deshalb nach nur 10 Jahren das Feld räumen musste, also 1990 bis 2000. Das bedeutet also, dass wenn Spannungen und Teilungen die Möglichkeit eröffnen, neue Partner und Ideen aufzunehmen, dies die Regime stabilisieren können. Lassen Sie mich den Hauptgutachter, der heute auch hier unter uns sitzt, in deutscher Übersetzung zitieren. Die Arbeit ist vor allem ein außergewöhnliches Beispiel von Forschung. Sie ist theoretisch anspruchsvoll und offeriert einen wichtigen Beitrag für das Studium kompetitiver autoritärer Regime. Die Ergebnisse basieren auf umfangreicher Feldforschung, einschließlich ausführlicher Interviews mit Politikern, Beobachtern und Experten, vor allem in Montenegro. Die Arbeit stützt sich auch auf Parlamentsdebatten, Berichte in den Medien sowie andere primäre und sekundäre Quellen. Der Gutachter betont, dass die Arbeit gut formuliert und klar strukturiert ist und eine der besten Doktorarbeiten darstellt, die er begleitet oder begutachtet hat. In der Tat, dem kann nichts hinzugefügt werden. Die Dissertation ist faszinierend, aufregend und durchaus auch innovativ bezüglich der gewählten Fragestellung. Deshalb kann ich Frau Laštro im Namen des Preis- und Stipendienausschusses nur zu ihrer Arbeit gratulieren und betonen, dass die Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft stolz ist, diese Arbeit mit dem 2026er Dissertationspreis auszeichnen zu können. Unsere besten Wünsche für die künftige akademische Orientierung von Frau Laštro begleiten Sie. Vielen Dank.
Vielen herzlichen Dank an die Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft sowie an die Fritz und Helga Exner-Stiftung für die Würdigung meiner Doktorarbeit und ganz herzlichen Dank auch an Lothar Altmann für die wohlwollenden Worte und die Laudatio. Die Laudatio hat mir nochmals eine Eigenheit wissenschaftlicher Arbeit vor Augen geführt. Und zwar, dass fertige Arbeiten oft eine Linearität suggerieren, also vom theoretischen Problem über das Argument, die Fallstudie zum Ergebnis, die nicht unbedingt die tatsächlichen Forschungsprozesse gänzlich abbilden. Und ich denke, womöglich werden sich manche der heute Anwesenden noch daran erinnern, dass ich zu Beginn meines Doktorats nicht unbedingt von einem theoretischen Problem motiviert war, sondern vielmehr von einer ausgeprägten Neugier und einem großen Interesse an Montenegro. Denn zu Beginn meines Doktorats war Montenegro noch nach wie vor und ununterbrochen von der sozialistischen Nachfolgepartei, der DPS, regiert worden. Und meiner Ansicht nach war das ein Phänomen, das bis dato nur unzureichend von der Forschung erklärt worden war, die meistens diesen Erfolg und diese Kontinuität mit Rekurs auf die programmatischen Anreize der Partei erklärt haben. Nach meinen ersten eigenen Recherchen allerdings hat sich für mich ergeben, dass die Praktiken des Machterhalts vielmehr dem ähnelten, was ich aus der Autoritarismusforschung kannte. Es brauchte allerdings etwas Zeit und viel Literaturstudie, bis ich dann erkannte, dass Montenegro nicht nur ein interessanter Fall an und für sich war, sondern auch ein Fall war, der selbst neue Impulse und Erkenntnisse zur Autoritarismusforschung beitragen konnte, insbesondere zur Literatur zum Thema Resilienz, Stabilität, autoritäre Regime und Koalitionsdynamiken. Denn entgegen bestehender Forschungsmeinungen, nachdem, wie Lothar Altmann bereits erwähnt hat, Elitenspaltungen in der Regel als Hauptursache für das Scheitern autoritärer Regime angesehen werden, erlebte die DPS in Montenegro wiederholt Spaltungen, allerdings ohne, dass die Partei destabilisiert worden wäre, sondern vielmehr diese Spaltungen noch zur Anpassungsfähigkeit der Partei beizutragen schienen. Was letztendlich dann meine Frage motivierte, ob Elitenspaltungen unter gewissen Bedingungen auch Regime stabilisieren können. Die Laudatio hat bereits mein Argument dargestellt und auch die zugrunde liegenden Mechanismen. Deswegen werde ich nicht nochmal auf technische Details eingehen. Es gibt allerdings einen Aspekt, von dem ich denke, dass er auch Relevanz hat über die Autoritarismusforschung hinaus und der mir wiederholt begegnet ist in Analysen und Gesprächen. Und zwar die Tendenz, Konflikte und Spaltungen in autoritären Regimen auf der Führungsebene oft durch eine Art Zerspiegel des Wunschdenkens wahrzunehmen. Und ich denke, dass es zwei Charakteristika gibt, die besonders zu viel Interpretation einladen. Das erste ist, dass stabilisierende Elitenspaltungen oft als Reformprozesse verschleiert werden und inszeniert werden. Und dabei sehen wir in der Regel, dass sich ein Lager als Reformer inszeniert, die sich dann zu einer programmatischen Neuausrichtung bekennen und zu einer Abkehr von autokratischen Praktiken, die sie in der Regel den rivalisierenden Eliten zuschreiben und die dafür verantwortlich machen. Allerdings wird dabei oft übersehen, dass jenseits vom gezielten Ausschluss einiger Teile der Regimeelite es nicht zu einer strukturellen Veränderung der Machtverhältnisse kommt. Also es geht vielmehr um einen Machtwettbewerb, um die Verteilung der Macht auf Führungsebene des Regimes und nicht darum, wie Macht generell im politischen System verteilt ist. Der zweite Aspekt ist der selektiven Kooptation von Oppositionsakteuren, die den Reformnarrativen der Regimeelite, dieser vermeintlichen Reformelite, Legitimität verleihen. Häufig werden diese als demokratische Öffnungen fehlinterpretiert, was auch damit zu tun hat, dass Kooptationen häufig mit Zugeständnissen des Regimes Anti-Opposition einhergehen, zum Teil also Beispiel in Form von Politiken oder auch institutionellen Reformen. Es ist aber dabei wichtig zu differenzieren, dass es sich hierbei nicht um einen Ausdruck der demokratischen Gesinnung der autokratischen Elite handelt, sondern vielmehr um Instrumente der Machtkonsolidierung der neuen Mehrheiten. Oft wird dabei auch übersehen, dass die Opposition sich selbst in einem strategischen Dilemma befindet und nicht unbedingt diese neuen Koalitionen ohne Skepsis und Vorbehalte eingeht, sondern vielmehr strategisch oder taktisch begrenzte Reformchancen in Kauf nimmt und eventuell auch in der Hoffnung, diese noch ausbauen zu können und nimmt davor eben in Kauf, dass zentrale Machtressorts unter der Kontrolle der alten Eliten verbleiben. Es gilt also genau zu überprüfen, wie und ob überhaupt Elitenspaltungen Kompetenzen in Kernressorts, Schlüsselbehörden und zentralen Wirtschaftszweigen neu verteilen, denn solche strategischen Neuausrichtungen vorschnell als Demokratisierung zu interpretieren, kann unter Umständen autoritäre Anpassungsleistungen extern legitimieren und genuine Opposition marginalisieren. Zuletzt bleibt mir nur zu sagen, dass die Arbeit nicht ohne den Beitrag zahlreicher Personen und Institutionen zustande gekommen wäre. An erster Stelle wäre zu nennen die Stiftung der deutschen Wirtschaft und das Rudi-Roth-Stipendium, die mir eine 3-jährige Vollfinanzierung meiner Doktorarbeit ermöglichten, sowie auch einen 8-monatigen Forschungsaufenthalt in Montenegro. Außerdem auch das Netzwerk der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft, das unschätzbaren Wert für meinen Feldzugang hatte. Ich danke auch allen meinen InterviewpartnerInnen, ohne die meine Forschung nicht möglich gewesen wäre, auch wenn sie womöglich nicht mit allen meiner Schlussfolgerungen übereinstimmen. Ja. Ich danke auch meiner Familie und meinen Freunden für ihren Beistand und auch dafür, dass sie mich mit lästigen Fragen zum Fortschritt meiner Arbeit weitgehend verschont haben. Und ganz besonderer Dank gilt Florian Bieber, meinem Mentor, der mich immer unterstützt hat und mir die nötige Orientierung geboten hat, aber dabei auch die Freiheit ließ, auch Umwege zu gehen, um letztendlich mein eigenes theoretisches Problem zu finden. Das war ein großes Privileg. Vielen Dank.
Ja, vielen Dank für diese Laudatio, diese Antwort. Es gibt natürlich eine Urkunde. Der Text ist Ihnen, Frau Laštro, besonders gut bekannt. Deswegen werde ich auf die Verlesung diesmal einfach verzichten, wenn das okay ist. Einfach nochmal einen Applaus für diese großartige Arbeit und dass Sie heute bei uns sind.
Frau Laštro, auch nochmal im Namen der Stiftung möchte ich Ihnen sehr herzlich gratulieren, auch im Namen der Stifterin, Frau Exner-Freifeld. Und mein persönlicher Eindruck ist, solange wir Arbeiten wie Ihre haben, hat unsere Stiftung auch eine Existenzberechtigung. Solange es solche Arbeiten gibt, gibt es was zu fördern. Das ist auch für unsere Stiftung sehr schön und existenzbegründend. Herzlichen Glückwunsch.
Und jetzt würde ich das Mikrofon übergeben an unseren Moderator, Professor Dr. Bauer, für die Podiumsdiskussion.
Thank you, Manuel. Sarrazin, and we are going to switch to English. Now, I actually had planned to also welcome you at this wonderful sunny day, one of the first days without fog in what is usually a very foggy winter in Regensburg, but also this day is a very clouded one. Most of you certainly have already read the news that Israel and the US launched a major attack on Iran this morning, which most likely is going to a larger war in a region which is adjacent to our one, and whatever happens in the Near East will also have a direct impact on Southeastern Europe. Which one we can't tell, but most likely not a very pleasant one. I also fear that our panel is also not going to discuss very joyful themes. It in a way also links what we have heard already or started to discuss yesterday in this really very interesting, even though very depressing symposium of the of the academic advisory board of Southeast of the Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft, where we heard especially about Hungary and how Hungary rather successfully promotes its ideas of illiberal democracy in inverted comma, where questions of demographic anxieties, pronatalism play an important role also in how Viktor Orban and Fidesz promote their very peculiar way of interpreting democracy. We have heard about the demographic summit, which serves as one of those major platforms that helps Viktor Orban to project and maybe even to wield influence across Hungary's borders. These questions of demographic anxiety will be very much at the forefront at our roundtable discussion. First of all, thank you to all the panelists who came and agreed to participate in this discussion, which is a roundtable that is also linked to one of the major research projects at our institute at IOS, together with partners in Graz. Florian is one of them, Sofia and Budapest. We have been studying, exploring anxieties of aging and demographic anxieties in a more broader sense in Southeastern Europe, from an interdisciplinary perspective, with the goal also to think about ways of how to transform these anxieties into some sort of more productive public policies. And that's going to be one of the major themes also of our round table. This project, I should also credit the funding agency, is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation in their larger program, Challenges of Europe. And when you think of some of the peculiar challenges for Southeast European societies and also how they are perceived, then we indeed will very soon land with the topic of demography. There are few regions in Europe or maybe in the world where publics and also policymakers, media, pay so much attention to demographic development, but usually framing it in a very apocalyptic, catastrophic way. When census results are published, well, first of all, that's also quite peculiar to Southeastern Europe. They tend to be very contested, and not only because minorities believed to be undercounted, but sometimes even the overall headline figures for total populations are contested, like in the Albanian case with the most recent census, which is most likely undercounting the resident population of Albania. But media then would report about the imminent demographic apocalypse. You will see newspaper articles with headlines like "Country so-and-so will rest only on the shoulder of some few remaining old people." And policymakers as well usually subscribe to this very catastrophic, apocalyptic narrative. So one of the tasks of our panel is to also unpack and disentangle these narratives and to try to dissociate what we could consider as real policy challenges from what is more likely to be nationalistic fear-mongering. We collected an excellent group of experts, starting from the right, and Manuel already introduced them briefly. Eva, who is a professor of gender studies at the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University, now mainly Vienna, as we all know, and but still also, of course, with the location in Budapest. Eva is a sociologist by training. Then we have Maja Mitte from University of Skopje, where she is professor of social work at the Department of Social Policy and Social Work at Kirill and Method University in Skopje, with a PhD in social work and social policy, which maybe just in the Kavita, I think Yugoslavia or former Yugoslavia is one of these places that introduced very early chairs and departments for social work and social policy at universities already, I think, back in the 1960s. Then Ainur Kanafina, who is a regional expert at the UNFPA regional office, United Nations Fund for Population Activities regional office in Istanbul for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And we have been communicating and working with the UNFPA, with Ainur and her colleagues within our project for the last couple of Yes, and then last but not least, Florian Bieber, who is of course very unknown in this association. His most important role is being vice president of the Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft. Apart from that, he is now recently started to moonlight as a historian, writing a book, A History of Hvar. But other than that, of course, well known as the director of the Center for Southeast European Studies and professor of politics and contemporary history at the University of Graz. And he is also one of the principal investigators in our project. I want to start with Ainur also because you have this, of course, this very comparative view, because the regional office in Istanbul doesn't deal only with Southeastern Europe, but also Central Asia. So basically a landscape of huge demographic variety. But when we look at public concerns about population development, population decline, low fertility, emigration, so these processes that are shaping as a megatrend also Southeast European societies. So where do you locate kind of the real challenges for public policy making? So can you help to disentangle what should be addressed and can meaningfully addressed by policymakers, and what is rather more a narrative that might serve a very different purpose?
Thank you so much. It's very lovely to be here this morning. It's very nice and sunny, unexpectedly, yes, very warm even compared to Istanbul, which was very cold and rainy. Before answering your question, Professor Brunbauer, I wanted to really say that it's a big privilege to be here. Every day at the UNFPA regional office, we wake up with these questions and try to answer these for the governments we collaborate with. This is our bread and butter. And thanks to the projects like yours, research that the most academics are conducting, we're using these best practices to advise governments on the very questions that were just addressed. So indeed, we cover Eastern Europe, Caucasus, Turkey, Central Asia, 16 countries. But we also collaborate very heavily with the rest of the world, with Western Europe, with Asia Pacific, Latin America, who face similar challenges. So with that in mind, I wanted to start with really saying that we're living in 21st century, trying to use the systems of the 20th century, which are really designed and focused on young people and growing populations, but we really need to start adapting. And talking about Southeastern Europe, we do face the very same questions literally every day, where governments come to us and they say, okay, practically, what can you help us with? What can you do? How can you advise us? So I will start with a few sort of setting points, and then maybe I'll dive into some examples, but I'll try to stick to the time limit that I have. When it comes to depopulation, of course, there's a lot of fear, decline in numbers, immigration, low fertility, aging. It's really looked at as a threat. The silver economy is not really embraced, but more is looked like a burden for the countries. And fertility is looked as a patriotic duty. And we can see the decline of sexual reproductive rights for women in many countries because of this kind of narrative. Of course, we are looking at the fiscal and social infrastructure, how it affects pension reforms. There is also a pronatalist trap whereby people really focus on the number of children rather than the quality of life. Rather than looking at family-friendly policies, how do we make workforce more agile? How can we adapt to the system so that the whole population, including women, can be really active in the workforce? We also look at migration paradox, the brain drain, the international workers. And really, what we are trying to focus on is not looking at the quantity of people, but rather quality of their lives. And it's not an easy topic to do, not an easy task to do. So maybe, for instance, in North Macedonia, we are supporting the government with addressing these issues in a very comprehensive demographic strategy document. But now we see actually kind of a trend. It's not only North Macedonia. All of a sudden, many countries in our region want to produce these demographic strategies all-encompassing, covering so many things, but unrealistic because they are trying to cover many, many topics without prioritization. And a lot of this national strategies very much, I mean, national demographic strategies overall they're just too heavy and they're really unrealistic. The amount of resources that is needed to make them happen is really beyond what the countries can endure. Sometimes, of course, the politicians use some kind of rhetoric that will be very beneficial for them in the next elections. I will give you an example. I will not name the country. I actually shared it last night. One of the governments approached us and they said, okay, so we would like population in our country to achieve a certain target, meaning a number of people. Ethnically has to be the original, and this target has to be achieved by a certain deadline. And then we said, well, did you actually calculate that on average, every fertile woman would have to have 8 children? How realistic is that? And they was like, oh yeah, we didn't really think about that. And of course, the person in charge was a man. He wasn't really thinking about the women. He was thinking about how he can promote himself in the government and then yeah, and when you start asking the question, but why do you need this number of people? And they said, oh, but we don't want any immigrants. We just want only our own people. And when I was like, what does that mean? Your own people. And of course, they look at diaspora. They're saying, okay, maybe we can ask people of our own ethnic origin to come back. But how attractive is the country to live in? We also look at rural depopulation. We look at, is it attractive to live in your country? And of course, there are now policies that countries are looking at. So what we're trying to promote at NFPA is to look at realistic scenarios, to really not focus on quantity, but rather quality of lives that people have to make these countries attractive, because rural depopulation in Southeastern Europe is also a huge issue. I remember last year, I traveled from all around Bosnia. It's like a city, and then everything else in between is just abandoned buildings. Schools are closing down. I know some schools some prisons were turned into healthy aging centers. And I was like, but how can you turn a prison from a healthy aging center, or even the atmosphere, the vibe? You really have to think about the design and the architecture of the building. Like, oh yeah, there is an empty building. So even there was an idea to take a prison, half of it is prison and the other half is for aging people. Really? So, and then there was also an interesting idea. Oh, we want older persons and younger persons to, communicate better. And then, okay, let's just put them together in one building, old people, young people, and somehow make them talk. This is not how it works. You really need to think. It's not like you physically put people and say, okay, you people go, you talk, and we finally bridge the generational gap. I'm sorry, but this is not how it works these days. Young people and a young person in one country is closer associated to a young person in another country rather than a person within their own country but older in age. Now, even 2 years in South Korea is like a huge generational gap. So the kind of ideas that we come across, they're funny on one hand, but quite ridiculous on the other. So again, what we're trying to promote, and I will touch upon this in the next question, is the concept of demographic resilience rather than demographic threat. And if you want to hear more funny stories from me, I'm more than happy to tell you off after lunch, because really it's really interesting. So again, we're very thankful for the research the academics are producing, because we're trying to use these very best practices and really promote them to make sure that the policies are coherent, cohesive, realistic, achievable with the resource that the countries have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ainur. And thanks for making us laugh, even though we're discussing a very serious topic. We will by the way most likely have 2 rounds. So first one with like this 5-minute statements and a short one further questions and responses to each other, and then we open up, because I think overall we have like 90 minutes or so. I was told. Florian, you are, as we all know, a specialist of Southeastern European politics, and it would also not least of Serbia, but not only. But if you look at countries like Serbia, which I think is an excellent example of the also paradoxes of population policies, where you have for decades this very expansive discourse about the Bela Kuga, the white plague, fears of depopulation, of course, in the 1980s, also related to the fear of the growing Albanian population. One might think this problem has been solved because Kosovo is not part of Serbia anymore. Anyway, and very aggressive pro-natalist policies introduced under by Vučić and his governments, but at the same time, not really a situation that is improving. So one wonders what's actually the connect between the kind of political system, political culture, entrenched nationalism and demographic worries, but also demographic policy making.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the I think what is the challenge is, as Ulf, you've mentioned, is there's a long historical debate about demographic anxieties. In the past, they used to be framed in the context of minorities, majorities. So we have a long discourse in the post-Yugoslav space about which nation is bigger and the anxieties of other nations that they would lay claim. I mean, this in particular in regard to Kosovo and relations between Serbian and Albanian populations, with Serb demographers for a long time projecting huge number of Albanians which would overpower the Serbian population. But these debates have shifted, and so in that sense I would say there's a qualitative change. But now I would say these demographic anxieties which we've heard about is really defined by these multiple features, as I have here, like an aging population, and again, as mentioned by Ainur, emigration from rural to urban environments, continued emigration outside of the country, as well as immigration to the countries, which has really transformed the region. If you've traveled through many countries of Southeastern Europe, we notice in the last, especially since COVID, a transformation in terms of labor force, whether it is mine workers in Bor, whether it is factory workers in Zrenjanin, whether it is food delivery or service or bus drivers in Zagreb. There is a huge influx of labor migration, which is kind of not talked about, but it's increasingly visible. And then we have, of course, low birth rates, and all of that. I think, we can say many of these phenomena might exist elsewhere, but I think what makes the region particular is the combination of emigration and immigration, as well as the fact that there is, with, let's say, smaller countries and smaller nations, often the sense of anxiety of extinction, the narratives of extinction. And here, you have a perfect example. This is from a Serbian newspaper, which is, the white plague is the term used. Or if you mentioned it already, the white plague is merciless. For 1 year, we've lost Užice, which is one of the towns in Serbia. And every fifth citizen is old, which, I don't know, sounds as if it's a horrible threat. Anyhow, so what and I want to just share, if we can go to the next slide. I just have a slideshow because we've done, in the context of this project, also an opinion poll in 4 countries of Southeastern Europe, and Hungary, in North Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Serbia. And indeed, one finds very clearly that this anxiety is shared by the population. So many people, especially in North Macedonia and Serbia, a vast majority of citizens are very concerned about the aging societies. And this is of course very much in censuses what is promoted. But at the same time, there is a paradox, because indeed governments in power suggest, both in Hungary as well as in Serbia in particular, with their strong nationalist undercurrents, suggest that they have a solution for it. So in a certain way, they have to manage these anxieties. But how do you deal with the challenges of an aging society, which is shrinking, and where you have headlines here again, is the white plague is killing us, which, of course, is a bit of an interesting observation. Now, how do people see the response, how to respond to this challenge? And if we can just go to the next slide. Here. So we asked, said, okay, what is the way to address this? So, of course, if you ask politicians in the region, often what you find is they blame the women usually. I mean, this is something which is a very common phenomena. So we had a Serbian minister, Ratko Dmitrijević, who was a minister in charge of demography, who blamed it on women's lifestyles, very, very simply. And then there was also a pro-natalist campaign in North Macedonia a decade ago, which was, saying our great-grandmothers didn't live for the latest iPhone series. They lived for the sound of a baby crying. So this was the kind of logic that, in a certain way, this is the approach. But this is so it becomes and I think it dovetails well with what Ainur was saying. Instead of following the responsibility to be with the state to improve quality of life or childcare, it's individualized. The responsibility for the demographic crisis is shifted to the individual and in particular to women as being the prime cause of this demographic crisis, rather than lack of state services, lack of state provision of healthcare, and other issues. And again, also most of state interventions focus on financial incentives to families to have children, but not about the quality of life you can secure for your children. But if you're looking at we're asked people, what are the best answers for dealing with an aging population? And so what you see there is, number one, in all of the countries we did the survey, is economic and social conditions to be improved. Much more so than financial assistance to families, which is the main government policy. So their citizens have a slightly different preference. But then number three, return immigration. This is also something which you've mentioned. So the idea of rather bringing people back, but again, the question is how and why would they return? And then the fourth is to prevent emigration. So I don't know how that will work, to not have people leave their own country. And the interesting element, and I think this shows you, I think, the real dilemma. So then there are more people in favor of preventing abortion than having immigration as a response to the demographic crisis. So this tells you that the idea that immigration can help relieve the socioeconomic challenges by a shrinking population is the least popular of all of the, options listed. And that, I think, brings about the major paradox we have in the region, where, in fact, this has been de facto the main response, because labor migration is happening, and is happening even in countries like Hungary, where it's constantly talking against migration. It's happening basically through other tools. But at the same time, there is no popular awareness or readiness to accept this as a response, while all of the other responses have either not worked or have not been really genuinely tried by society. So there is by government. So we see a major gap between citizens' expectations, what government offers, and the reality. And all of that, of course, compounds the crisis and unfortunately makes it harder to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. And I think this paradox also, or cognitive dissonance, also on the side of both policymakers and popular expectation, is nicely captured by the Ministerstvo za demografiju i useljeništvo, the Ministry of Demography and Immigration in Croatia, which was established in 2024, is run by a representative of the Domovinski Pokret, this right-wing obscurantist outfit. And of course, this guy thinks of immigration all in terms of repatriation of ethnic Kurds, while at the same time subscribing to the idea of population replacement. So it's probably the ideal minister for immigration that you can imagine. I mean, when we talk about these demographic anxieties and population policy, then we usually talk about aggregated numbers, total fertility rates, aggregated positive or negative population growth, net immigration or net emigration, where at the same time, what we perceive as an aggregated demographic trend is always the result of a myriad of individual decisions. And obviously, people don't decide about their reproductive behavior having in mind the aggregate development. Why would, which is why I want to ask Maya maybe to turn this whole story a bit upside down and approach it from the social work, social policy perspective, because I think there's obviously one area where you would see a real challenge, regardless of whatever the narrative is, which is the care cycle. Because obviously aging means that there are more older people, which as someone who is also now soon belonging to this group finds actually very positive development. But at some point in our life, at the beginning and at our end, we will need care. We depend on others. So how does this look like in a country like North Macedonia, which experiences significant emigration, not only like generally, but especially also of people who would work in the care sector or the healthcare system, not least because Germany is recruiting them systematically. Of course, it's good for the German taxpayer if we have these people trained in North Macedonia and then recruit them as skilled professionals. So how can a small, relatively poor country with weak institutions address these real life problems of aging and depopulation from the point of view of care systems?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So, yes, thank you very much for the question. It's really a challenge to even begin and discuss different challenges, because we can speak from the perspective of the social protection system and the long-term care system, but also from the perspective of each individual and how it can access it or not. But before going into detail about that, what was briefly mentioned by the other speakers, I just want to address, for example, in terms of the care system. For example, Florian mentioned about how do we prevent migration and what are the examples. So in terms of care workers, particularly those that come to Germany, and second countries, Switzerland, third is Italy, according to migration numbers from North Macedonia. People at the level of, let's say, agency for employment and other ministry level administratives who actually think how we can make the certificates that we provide to care workers be valid only for the country. Because after a 3 or 4 month course, which the course is financed by the public, by the central government, then these workers migrate and go to Germany, and it's valid for work here as a care worker. So this is, let's say, administrative thinking how to prevent migration in terms of making the certificates legit only for North Macedonia and not wider. I don't know where that's possible, but it's one way of how they think of preventing migration. But yeah, the long-term care system is really fragmented in North Macedonia. So it's a division between what the healthcare system provides and what the social protection system provides. And while this fragmentation does not really, is not problematic in terms of both the people that ask for services within the system, but providers have already accustomed to this division. It's more the lack of services. Since in 2019, we had the social protection reform, which actually focused on financing long-term care by the government. So now in terms of home care, because previously it was mostly informal and it was not really financially supported, but now the government is supporting at least 80 hours of free home care for citizens above 65. That's a positive thing. But of course, lack of workforce is a huge demand. So particularly in the smaller and rural municipalities, you would not find really a carers. You have right to this, and it's actually stipulated as a right within the social protection law, but you cannot access it because there is a lack of carers apart from the few bigger cities, then it's not accessible. So in that respect, really migration or out-migration is a huge issue, because it's not only a loss of labor, but it's loss of care arrangements, which have been built throughout the years. And this is something probably that we need to tackle upon more in terms of policy responses, which I guess we will speak in the next round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Now, Eva, yesterday we have already learned in this wonderful, optimistic roundtable that Hungary is pretty much ground zero for pro-natalist policies, also in the way how it promotes these policies linked to this idea of defending the traditional family, whatever this is, but also probably also linked to a very specific notion of Europe, which is a white Europe where white European Hungarian women are supposed to procreate in order to defend Europe from those non-European, not so white masses. At the same time, the Hungarian government, since Viktor Orban came to power again in 2010, has invested a lot in all kinds of welfare schemes targeting fertility rates with a demographic success where you would say, okay, it's less than meet your eyes, considering the staggering costs. So can you disentangle a little bit sort of the social policy component on the one hand, which one might think might also enjoy some popularity because it comes with real money for middle-class families, and the wider ideological agenda of Viktor Orban and Fidesz, anti-feminism, anti-LGBT, anti-immigrant. To what degree is this actually driving the pro-natalist demographic policies?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here, and I really appreciate you showing up on a beautiful, beautiful Saturday morning to listen to these rather depressing stories, but important ones. So yeah, the question, I understood your question as asking how pronatalism fits into the logic of Orban's illiberal regime. And if you look at what's happening, it is indeed a huge part of both the political discourse and the policy making as well. So for example, if you enter Hungary via the airport, I don't know if you've done it, instead of, Nike ads and bank advertisements, you see huge posters advertising Hungary as a family-friendly country, whatever that might mean. And Hungary spends an inordinate amount of its GDP on family protection measures, so-called family protection measures. And I think we have introduced a whole range of really sort of innovative tools that was partially dreamt up by Hungarian policymakers, partially taken from elsewhere. So for example, if you promise, so we have preemptive pronatalist policies. It's not that if you have children, you get some money to help raise those children, but if you promise to have children, you can then apply for a grant. This is a very different logic, and it will have a very different consequences for people. So you get married, and you and your new husband walk into the bank and say, I hereby promise to have 3 children in the next, I think 8 to 10 years. And you can get a lot of money. And when I say a lot of money, I mean, this is like 3 years average salary of an average worker. And you can get it as a loan. If you have those children, then the loan is forgiven. So then it's a grant. It turns into a grant. The little problem is that if you don't actually have those 3 children, then you have to pay it back, and you have to pay it back with penalties. The impact of this is not clear yet because it hasn't actually been, or it has barely been 10 years. So people are just running out, are at the end of this. But you can imagine the kind of, given that, this is a country where 1/3 to 1/2 of marriages end in divorce, and you can imagine the impact of that on when those children on people when those children don't materialize. Another really ingenious measure is the one that was introduced by the government now in preparation for the election. And this is that women who have at least 2 children do not have to pay taxes, ever. Even if your children are grown, if you ever had 2 children, you're exempt from taxes. This had been already in effect for women with 4 children, but very few women with 4 children were in the labor market anyway. But now this has gone down to even to impact, for women with 2 children. I mean, to some extent, this is a feminist dream. I teach in a gender studies department. We've been demanding wages for housework and the appreciation of birthing and raising children. It is also possibly a tool to reduce, with the wage gap. I mean, the men, fathers are not getting this money. It's only mothers. But of course, it's also increasing wage differences amongst women, those who have children and those who don't. So the point I'm trying to make is that the Hungarian government has introduced a lot of ingenious and really half-baked policies to support, to encourage people to have more children. And we can talk about the success later. Now, why did they do that? Interestingly, the idea of this demographic anxiety, the anxieties about aging, doesn't really show up in Hungarian political discourse. What it does show up is an anxiety about immigration. So pronatalism is always, and the encouragement of having children is always connected to the rejection of immigrants, even though you cannot order food in Budapest anymore without speaking English, because the person who's going to deliver it is not going to speak Hungarian. So clearly there's a lot of labor migration. But this was indeed, in fact, the pronatalist policy started in 2015 when there's this deluge of a huge wave of refugees swept through Hungary. They never wanted to stop in Hungary. They all wanted to come to Germany. But the Hungarian government got an anxiety attack just by seeing all these not so white faces crossing the Hungarian border. And this is what prompted the acceleration of pronatalist policies. So it is clearly sort of meant, and in fact, explicitly, the Hungarian government emphasizes its racist and Islamophobic position. So the idea is to have red-blooded white Christian Hungarians instead of other kinds of people. So I think this is important. The anxiety is not so much about aging. It's an ethnocentric, ethno-nationalist anxiety. That I'm sure accompanies, as you mentioned, the pronatalist policies elsewhere, but it's really in the forefront in Hungary. And another point, and this is the last one, I promise, that I want to make is that in addition to having these policies, and in addition to using political rhetoric to fight immigration or the Ukraine or EU policies about you name it, because the Hungarian government uses its family friendliness to make that case. What it also does, what these policies also do, is they introduce a new logic of social citizenship. So social citizenship is your right as a citizen to welfare and well-being. States distribute unemployment benefits, pension, all sorts of benefits to the poor if you're impoverished, etc. You can get access to that in civilized countries on the basis of universal rights, or on the basis of need, or on the basis of social security. In Hungary, and in some of the Southeast European countries, these rights can now be accessed in the most efficient way through activities of care for children, through birthing and raising children. So instead of a workfare regime where you can get unemployment benefits or you can get welfare benefits or support if you have social insurance, if you have been working for a long time, in Hungary, you can get the most generous benefits if you promise to, or you actually do birth and raise children. This is changing the logic of social citizenship and introducing a new element to principles of citizenship. So I think it's interesting. I mean, of course, it's interesting theoretically as well as practically too.
Thank you, Eva. One could also note a certain irony that much of what you have been describing, I mean, obviously there's some real ingenuity here on the side of Fidesz and Orban, but much of that already was tried in the 1970s and 80s in some of the state socialist regimes. So population policies in Bulgaria and Romania look very similar to that. So it's interesting continuities between communism and a notionally anti-communist government. So we do a second round of quick questions focusing on public policy measures. So Ainur, starting with you again, I understood that if I'm head of government and call you Ainur, I want to grow my population by 5 million until 2050, you will tell me go back and do your math. But Ainur, if I call you, you know, dear UNFPA, we came up our government with a nice demographic strategy. We have this wonderful Ministry of Demography, and it's all under the headline of demographic security. So what I'm going to receive from UNFPA?
Thank you. First of all, I'm gonna just say beep beep, wrong number, and I'm gonna hang up on you. But no, of course, no. Of course, we're really trying to promote the concept of demographic resilience, and really focus on how the countries can adapt to the changes that are happening from the demographical point of view. So how can they really trying to think about the quality of life? How do we look at people, not just numbers, but individuals? What kind of conditions can we help governments to create for the people so that the society where they live is conducive to their lifestyle and well-being? So when it comes to demographic resilience, we talk about human capital, we talk about gender equality, migration. So when it comes to human capital investment, we're promoting so-called family-friendly policies. We have a flagship project actually funded by the government of Austria in also Southeastern Europe, where we're looking with private companies to look at what policies they have at the moment. How can these policies at the workplace be more inclusive, including for women, those who have children or don't have children, and what is the cost of not having family-friendly policies in place? For instance, in Bosnia, there was another project funded by the Czechs, which is about how do women who were outside of workforce for 10 plus years after giving birth to children, how can they return to the workforce? And again, actually Drogeriemarkt was very prominent private sector player in the field, and many of the women who work there, I mean, they had a chance to get some experience, and after sort of subsidizing their work there, I mean, UN subsidizing it, the private companies are retaining some of this talent. So we're really trying to support women and really bridge that gender gap. When it comes to, let's say, a case of Moldova, there was a study conducted, Gender and Generation Survey, which showed that on average, every Moldovan family wants to have 3 children. But in reality, they have 2 children. So the gap is 1 child. So then we're looking at how do we support the government, I mean, the people, to have the desired number of children that they want, more or fewer, depending on what they really want. Again, in Moldova, they have more than they actually have. So then we look at the reasons why. Is it some medical issues or some financial issues? Is there anything that the government can help to address those? I also wanted to mention that at the moment, UNFPA is conducting a study, Youth Aspirations Survey. It also covers region Southeastern Europe, where we're asking young people their reproductive preferences, why they're having children, not having children, what is the reason, financial issues, climate change, not being able to find a partner, and also many children in Southeastern Europe, I mean, more than half, for instance, in Bulgaria, are produced outside of wedlock. So they don't get married, but they still produce children, which is a very different behavior from, let's say, South Korea, where mostly children are produced in families. So we're also looking at these behaviors and how can we really help analyze this. There are some policies which we're not supporting, but nevertheless, the governments are working on. For instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they're supporting in vitro fertilization. It's being subsidized by the government. I think, I don't remember, 2 or 3 times you try, it's covered by the government. So really, there's so many policies that the countries are exploring. And I'm talking about the concept of demographic resilience, but I also wanted to touch upon the concept of demographic security, because this is how the idea behind demographic resilience started. So people thought about demographic security as if it's some kind of threat, that there's some kind of enemy who needs to be dealt with. And this is not really what we're promoting, because it can lead to erosion of reproductive rights, looking at women as not only not wanting to produce children, but return to traditional domestic roles. And really, it's exclusive and has very pronatalist idea. And maybe one final thought to complete is at UNFPA, our mandate is about population, sexual reproductive rights, gender-based violence, young people. And whenever we talk about family planning, many governments immediately have a perception that family planning is about abortion, or family planning is about not having children. Whereas planning just means planning. So how many children do you plan to have? Like in Hungary 3, or I mean, what would be your ideal outcome? 0, 3, 5? But again, because of the perception of this word, it really creates even more anxieties among governments whenever we talk to them. So we're also trying to change that perception, but it's not an easy task. And right now we see a very, a trend whereby many governments are establishing demographic centers, writing demographic strategies. Everybody wants to be, a flagship country to do some breakthrough policies. But so far, it's a really challenging and daunting task. And I think we can definitely work on this together. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's, Maya, continue with you. We have already addressed this question of migration, also of care workers. I remember we did, in the framework of our project half a year ago, we did a roundtable discussion with local stakeholders, for example, people from local hospitals who are systematically recruiting from the Western Balkans, obviously using also the so-called West Balkan regulation, which makes it fairly easy for people from the Western Balkans to get work permit for Germany. Just in Germany, the local labor market for this kind of jobs is totally empty. So they have to take really huge efforts to recruit people in Southeastern Europe, and going also beyond Europe is one of the primary causes, which raises some questions of European inequality. And on the one hand, freedom of migration within Europe, at least within the EU, but increasingly also West Balkan countries. I think it's a major civilizational achievement. It makes life much better for individuals, but it might also lead to some real challenges for social systems. So what would you tell the German ambassador to Skopje, for example, or the EU representative, what they should do in order to prevent a total depletion of the Macedonian labor market?
I'm not sure that in terms of EU, as a country who has been for more than 20 years in the EU lobby in terms of waiting for the membership, we have any expectations in terms of the fact that also really the general population opinion towards the EU has subdued throughout these years. But there are, let's say, migration as an issue has shown us that we don't need to wait for public policy for some social problems to be resolved. For example, 15 years ago in North Macedonia, unemployment was a social and economic issue #1. Now there is no, it's not among first 3 policy or social and economic problems. Of course, now it's adequate incomes and proper job quality and so on. But what I'm saying is that we not always the public policies or even the best public policies resolve the issue. Sometimes they can be resolved, indirectly through other trends such as the migration. What I would say is probably a good practice so far, and it shows where some of the policy efforts can be targeted to is some local level initiatives. For example, there is a successful example, so-called community nurse, which runs in one of the statistical regions in North Macedonia, and it's successful in terms of the fact that it bridges this social and health aspect into one service. And it's kind of triangulated program between the social work centers, NGO providers, and the nurses or physiotherapists. So the social work centers provide the number of people above, let's say, 70 or above 75 who have really low income status. Either they use social assistance or have been rejected due to, I don't know, property ownership and so on. So unserved population that lives in rural regions and are served by this, let's say, combination of health and psychiatrists or psychologists or physiotherapists, because older people, let's say, at least in North Macedonia, they tend to accept more doctors and nurses rather than being given a home care, or so they don't want to admit that they need this and don't apply. So they are underserved also because of some form of stigmatization. So in that respect, there are some local example efficient programs that run it and can, in a way, make a change. At the European level, I would say there is this European care strategy, which can be linked with pre-accession funds. So in that way, you know, receive from this fund to train and to improve the trainings for the care workers, so it benefits both countries. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just then Eva and Florian, kind of same question, very brief response. So when it seems that this demographic anxieties, they also drive or amplify fears of immigrants, which in a way, theoretically, you can understand. Or if you believe that your wonderful nation is about to die out, you're probably even less likely to accept immigrants from somewhere else. On the other hand, I mean, it's a matter of fact that we are not going to see a reversal of demographic trends so that total fertility will again be above the replacement rate. That's just not going to happen. There are also not many sources of immigration from within Europe for countries like Hungary, Serbia, or Croatia. And Croatia, perfect example, where now most new immigrants come from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Philippines. So how do we break this doom cycle where demographic anxieties feed anti-immigration sentiments, which then translate into anti-immigration policies, which then amplify the demographic anxiety because the situation is just getting worse and worse?
Good question. Good question. I wish I knew the answer. I mean, how to break the cycle? I have a sort of a flippant answer to that, which is, you know, get rid of autocratizing authoritarian governments. And then,
Good start.
and then, you know, because I actually think that that this pronatalist direction, this ethnocentrism, really, what drives the pronatalism, is an integral part of authoritarian rule, at least in our part of the world. So even though in Hungary the birth rate has increased a little bit, but of course demographers know that when you introduce pronatalist measures, then the birth rate goes up a little. And then it started to dip, at which point the government introduced more pronatalist measures when it started to go up again. So, but clearly it's never going to reach the replacement level of fertility that the government, or even more, that the government was looking for. But it did achieve a number of things. So, for example, it got Orbán re-elected twice. And that was, I think, the primary goal. It also created an opportunity for the Hungarian liberal regime to differentiate itself from the European Union, to create this sense of identity and to find alliances who are willing, allies who are willing to who have the same ideology. it also allowed Orban to scapegoat certain parts of the population and exclude them from the windfall of pro-natalist benefits. So these benefits only can only be accessed or only be accessed fully by people who work on the formal labor market and have a decent salary. And often, if they're married, you can only get married if you're heterosexual. Same-sex marriage is not recognized, and same-sex unions are not accepted as for that. And a lot of people work on the informal labor market. In fact, a lot of those people happen to be Hungary's largest ethnic minority, the Roma. So scapegoating these groups, again, brings political advantages to the government. So the point I'm trying to make is that these pro-natalist measures have an impact well beyond, and an intended impact well beyond the number of births. I mean, Orban could not have been stupid. Every demographer told him that we're never going to increase the size, the population of Hungary beyond 10 million, which is what he's always pushing. It was impossible. He could not have been so stupid to actually believe that he would be able to achieve that. He had other goals, and those other goals were nicely achieved. So this is why I'm saying that one way to get rid of these pro-natalist policies or transform the way we think about demography is to get rid of authoritarian and illiberal leaders.
Florian, would you disagree with that?
Okay. No, of course, I would fully agree with that. And I mean, it's the paradox, of course, is that migration has actually increased under the rule of nativist authoritarian leaders across the region. I would say, of course, in Hungary's extreme, Serbia, for example, has much less emphasis on the anti-immigrant rhetoric and has actually, at least in practice, welcomed some migrants. Also, Croatia has done so for keeping the tourist sector alive. But what we're seeing is, first of all, a rise of far-right activism against authoritarian nationalist governments. So you have kind of grassroots movements who are against these migrants. But of course, these governments also pick very specific migrant groups, right? So they make sure they're not from Muslim countries and they're not from countries where refugees have fled through the country. So that's why Nepal, Philippines, Bangladesh are the sources of these migrants. They're expected to be manageable migrants. And I think the problem is that the migration policy which do exist, which is just not talked about, actually makes those migrants even more vulnerable because they come from further away. They often have very precarious labor conditions. They're often segregated from the society. They often have their passports taken away. So what we're seeing is actually emergence of a kind of slave-like migrant situation in a number of those countries. And that is, I think, the real problem we're facing, is that actually this doesn't stop migration. It just makes migration much more dangerous, or rather puts them in much more dangerous and much more precarious working conditions. Now, I don't think this is sustainable. This is not sustainable because people do start making their lives. The Nepalese or others don't want to go back immediately, so they become a permanent fixture. And I think this is, of course, let's remember the debate in Germany in the 1960s. I mean, the Gastarbeiter debate was not that different. It was also based on the idea they're coming, they're working, and then as soon as we can get rid of them, we'll get rid of them. I mean, this was not that different, just that they never left, or many never left, and the country had to come to terms with it. And I think this is something which the countries have to come to terms with, this reality, and it's going to be a difficult process, but certainly it's not going to happen with the autocratic nationalist leaders. But I think there will be lots of fractures along this way because there's no debate about this. But then again, there was no debate in many West European countries about this either for decades. So in that sense, I think we should be also careful in pointing the finger without realizing that these debates have also been delayed often for decades in countries which are now immigrant countries in reality.
Which might even give us some reason for hope and optimism, because obviously societies, even if they don't debate immigration, prove to be very resilient and very have a lot of potential to integrate migrants. So we still have, I don't know how many, I think 30 minutes or so for a Q&A, and I also already saw a first question, and maybe we collect 3 here, and then you're going to address whatever you want to address. Manuel, you have to be first.
Thank you. I have one question to Hungary and one to North Macedonia. So my question to North Macedonia is actually, you have this huge migration of care workers to Germany. where actually in the care working sector, you can have quite a good, not even a decent, quite a good salary, even for German standards. And I imagine that you will have, of course, there is the result that also the prices for care work in North Macedonia is increasing, like in the concurrency to the wages paid in Germany, while you don't have a real system to provide those prices with a kind of care insurance like we have in Germany. So would you say that even the good, relatively good care insurance system of Germany is putting actually price pressure for families for organizing care work in Macedonia? So how is this price point relevant? And on Hungary, my question is actually, I mean, I would love to make a lot of comments on this question with the free tax for women who have kids. I think actually you're really right. It's kind of helicopter money, and they decided they wanted to have a specific group of society to benefit. In Poland, you had this very successful 500 zloty program, which was giving every family money, and actually it was tackling the problem of child poverty and poor families very effectively. And obviously they didn't want to tackle this because it would benefit to not Hungarian-like situation. So, but it's actually only helicopter money, just giving electorate money. But my question is, as far as I heard, a lot of this workforce in Hungary also working for international companies, like for German automotive producers. And of course, there will be the conflict that still until now, those people haven't brought the families with them to Hungary. But it's totally idiotic to believe that if you have somebody working at Volkswagen or at Mercedes, after 3 years being fully in the job, knowing everything, Mercedes will accept that he will go back. Instead, of course, the moment will come when the families will follow, right? So how will then the situation in Hungary be politically there? Will they follow the wish of the German Volkswagen and the families will come, or will Fidesz, if they're still in power, say, no, 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 we don't accept the families, and then perhaps the workforce will move somewhere else to work in Germany or I don't know where in another plan.
Thank you. Maybe you keep this in mind, and we take 2 more questions, Gregor Meyer and Ambassador Steinacker.
Yes, good morning, Gregor Meyer. I'm the correspondent for the German press agency in Budapest and Belgrade and covering Southeast Europe. My question is about the care for the elderly in former Yugoslavian countries. We, as a kind of news reporter, we very often have catastrophes in homes for elderly people, which turn out to be private or even illegal, and with over catastrophic circumstances. And then they get in the news because some fire breaks out and 6 or 10 elderly people just die, or there is some disease which, because of the conditions, is spreading, and so on. So my question is this something which you have on the radar?
Okay, third one, and then you have time for a brief response.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, what I heard, but I'm missing one topic. It's not the topic of this roundtable, but it's a topic in all the 3 countries and has to do something with aging societies and not getting enough children. You have in all your countries considerable Roma population, which still have many children. Relatively, and what about them, about their integration into education, labor market? Okay, from Bulgaria, I know even some Macedonia, North Macedonia, many go to Germany. We have them in the rural area, for instance. But still, if you talk about this demographic problems, you have to talk about your own population in your countries, which is still badly integrated.
Okay, who wants to go first? Maya, you had a couple of questions. Maybe you start this time.
Yes, maybe I will start with the last question regarding Roma, and thank you for reminding me. I wanted to bring this aspect. Migration issue has indirectly also solved in a certain way Roma discrimination as well. Why? Because in the past, at least in Skopje, in the central part of Skopje, you would not see any Roma working in a restaurant, especially handling food. Now, with the worker shortage, Roma are employed all over the center. Maybe in the back jobs, in whatever, but still, it has solved one big issue. I'm not saying that it has solved the Roma discrimination, no, but it, at least now, they are more visible. And in that respect, you would also see Roma striking in front of the municipality, requiring better, I don't know, there was I think an issue with the transport from their municipality in Skopje to the center. So they were protesting, which was not at all possible, let's say, in the past, or it would not get the news attention. So in some way, there has been some improvement in relation to Roma employment, Roma integration, but it's not because of public policies, but it's because of shortage of workers, I would say. There are also increasingly bigger enrollments in the preschool, but of course we are lacking infrastructure for preschool because of, let's say, traditional society, so it's not still offered as much as it would have been used, I would say. On the question of the price point, of course, I mean, the demand has increased the prices in the care sector as well. I had an interview within a project for long-term care capacity, particularly from the perspective of private provision. And what the, let's say, service providers were telling me is that it's the most demanding sector, because when you compare the job that has been done in this sector and the price that they have to pay, they would easily make much more money in other sector without so much problems. So it's really a lack of private interest to invest in this. They're keeping the wages at the level, not at the minimum, of course, it's above the minimum, but it's like the salary of seller and like the cashier. It's not paid as much, but if they don't compete, they would lose out. Unfortunately, we do not have, as in Germany, long-term care insurance, and I don't think we will in a foreseeable future, because it won't be accepted by because one particularity in North Macedonia is that the contributions for the social insurance are paid by the employers, not employees. It's, I think, for a heritage from the Yugoslav system, and it's the culture and mentality that if you would give the full gross wage to the employer, then no one would pay the social insurance contribution. So it's paid by the employer. So it would be considered a much higher cost for employing employer if you add additional. But I would like to see that this would be also part of the contribution system. And I don't quite, and I understood the comment about the overall care system and how it reflects in the news media in the region. It's the same in North Macedonia. I just didn't quote whether there was a question. In North Macedonia, there is in the news, what you could see is also these examples of, I don't know, the owners of the care home being arrested because of inhuman treatment or this type of discussion also. And what was mentioned previously in the discussion, there is also this tendency that we are closing primary schools because of lack of birth rates in certain municipalities, and let's, repurpose them for care homes. So this is something you would also see in the news coverage. But if I miss part of the question, just let me know.
Maybe pass it over to Eva. I think that.
Thank you. So let me go in the reverse order and also talk about the Roma issue, which I mentioned briefly, but really briefly. And it's completely different from what you just described, because the Hungarian government has a lot of strategies about what to do about the Roma. The first strategy is that they do not collect data. So we have no idea really what's happening. Really, so the last survey was the one that we did in 2003, I think. So there's absolutely no information about, and also you're not allowed to, this is one of the countries where you're not allowed to ask or not allowed to label a person in a survey or in the census. So we don't actually have very little information, even about the proportion of Roma in Hungary. and very different estimates. Similarly, the Roma have more children than non-Roma population on average, but different groups of Roma have very different numbers of children. So the Roma living in the western part of Hungary, closer to work opportunities and educational opportunities, have many fewer children and are closer to the regular population than those who live in the really impoverished eastern part of the country. Those who live in the eastern part of the country, the government simply ignores. So they are excluded from all of these pronatalist options, because you have to work on the formal labor market and you have to be formally married. Now, the Roma are typically the people who do not work on the formal labor market, but work in informal jobs, and often are not married in the sort of state ceremony that is expected. And in addition, not only are they excluded, but the government has done everything and did it purposefully to create segregation in education institutions, in primary schools, in particularly in the eastern part of Hungary. It is totally obnoxious. If that's just a very simple, very sort of mild word that I can use to describe it. So if there's and they did that by pouring a lot of money into schools that are run by churches. Those schools are allowed to not take students who have, social issues. And then if you look at the student population, you see that in a small city in eastern Hungary, there are two major elementary schools. One is run by the Catholic Church and the other is a state school. In the state school, 80% of the students are Roma. In the Catholic school, 20% or 5% of the students are Roma. Guest suite school is better funded and have better teachers. And this is something that has been contested by NGOs, but the government always pushes back, even though the NGOs always win, in the courts, but the government is not doing anything about it, but intentionally is escalating this. So the situation of the Roma in Hungary is very dire, and some European institutions should do something about it quickly. And then a quick answer to your question. I think I understand this correctly. You're asking me how the government would view German migrants.
No.
Family reunification of migrant workers in, for example, these German-run car factories.
You mean that the Nepali workers would be
yes.
bringing their families? Yeah, no, that's out of the question. Forget it.
It does not for sure.
This is not. No, you're not allowed to do that. Period.
No,
Yes.
The question is the German car factories will not accept that it's just not allowed. They will push for changes in the law that will be allowed that the families come up.
Good luck is what I can say.
Families also didn't come immediately. They came up with something.
Good luck. The Hungarian government has managed to make deals with German car factories in a variety of ways, and has given. The German car factories are not. I don't think are pushing back so hard against the Hungarian government, or as hard as they should. But I seriously doubt that this is something that the government would be giving in, at least in larger numbers. I mean, in fact, the government is denying that there are guest workers in Hungary. So first of all, we don't believe that there are guest workers, or that there are immigrant workers in Hungary. So it's not, from what I've seen, with the companies. The major interest of large corporations is to have the economic benefits and the financial sort of goodies that the government can give and to stay alive, and their ability and willingness to make a political statement by, say, lobbying for family unification of their workers is limited. But maybe there will be a change in the future, but not that I know for the moment.
Yeah,
The workforce will be leaving at that time.
Then they'll get some other people from elsewhere. Okay.
We will see. I think
they haven't.
I think the situation is going to be very dynamic, because indeed Croatia might also get rid of its Nepali workforce, because they might at some point think, okay, we are treated so badly in Croatia, let's go to a more friendly place in Europe. And then you have the courts. I mean, all major positive changes in migration policy in the last decades came from the courts, who, for example, said that there's a human right of to live in a family. Of course, the Hungarian government is very good in dragging its feet, but I don't know. Let's end on an optimistic note because I was just told that we have to end basically here. Let's thank the wonderful panelists again. It was very, very, very interesting. Thank you for coming. Thanks for your interest. If you have if you want to learn more about what our project is doing and read our excellent pieces, we have a wonderful blog on the website of our Transforming Anxieties of Aging in Southeastern Europe project with academic and less academic texts, because that's indeed, I think, going to be one of the themes that will occupy us in the next couple of years for a variety of reasons. Thanks again for coming to Regensburg. Thanks to the Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft that after, I don't know, a decade or so, you did your annual assembly again in Regensburg. I hope it's not going to be the last time. You can also then visit our institute in 4 years when we will celebrate our centenary. So Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft is old, but the IOS is even old. I think I give back the word to you, Manuel.
Thank you again for this wonderful panel. The weather was nice, but to talk with you was even better. Thank you again for having us as a guest. Of course, if you're even older, then we feel very young. And thank you to everybody who was joining us today here and online. Afterwards, there is a small reception in front of the door. And yeah, the buffet is opened, and we open it with some music, with an applause for the music. And thank you so much.